Hey fellas, I'm leaving the door open now. No reason, it's fun, been in a good streak lately. But jump the shark.
I have it all now. Scoliosis, mitosis, bed bugs, bed bats.
So, I've got some free time to kill as I heal up. I might actually be able to talk about Sonic Unleashed. Or arcade machines allowing you to play Mario Kart with even more shame. They make morons a whole lot more obvious and give you something to do while skipping your uncle's funeral. Thank God for their existence. How would I play games without them? Buy a console? No, they didn't make Mappy for me to waste money, I have to play it. Arcade gaming seems like it's the cornerstone of the gaming industry. Some of the first video games of all time were arcade games, and they're the reason video games rose to popularity in the first place. And ever since, it's been a thriving, albeit faltering industry. The fact that they played on God anything but an actual console allows for greater graphical capabilities, particularly back in the 70s and 80s. As such, these things were, and still are, great. They let me lose my integrity in public. And the company most known for arcade gaming definitely wasn't Nintendo, but they sure tried. That's right, well nowadays they're known for making Wario. Nintendo made tons of arcade cabinets back in the 70s and 80s, and even now there are a good few lurking around. A decent few of these games were pioneers of the arcade industry, helping shape the market as it is today. Yet nobody ever talks about these. Whenever arcade games come up, the ones made by Nintendo are very rarely thrown into the combo. Was there a statewide ban, or am I just talking to the wrong people? Because the 7-Eleven cashier had nothing to say about these. But I just can't live with that. The world must know about computer overload, damn it! Well, if we're gonna go through all of this, we must travel back to the very beginning, i.e. the late 1880s. Humanity must have been really bored before then. Nintendo has been a company for over 130 years, which implies that they haven't always made, you know, video games. The easiest way to describe Nintendo before video games would be a toy company. Originally under the name Nintendo Koppai, the company originated out of Kyoto and was founded by Fuzzyjiro Yamauchi. The company's original objective? To produce and sell Hanafuda cards. Hanafuda cards translate to flower cards. Yeah, checks out. These cards are very heavily focused on looks, with each of them having wonderful art, typically in the form of nature. These were neat little things, and by little, I sure do mean it. These things are tiny, which definitely isn't the reason Nintendo moved on to other businesses, but to smoothly segue to the next section, it is now. In 1933, Fusajiro stepped down and his adopted son-in-law Sakura Yamauchi took over as president, renaming the company after an unlimited partnership, Yamauchi Nintendo & Company. 1947 rolls around and Sakura creates a distribution company, Marufuku Company Limited, to help distribute the cards. After suffering a stroke, Sakiyo's heir was to be his adopted son-in-law, Shikanojo Yamauchi, but since he abandoned his family, bring in Hiroshi Yamauchi, Shikanojo's son, and the longest-standing Nintendo president, holding office from 1949 to 2002. He was really the first president to start taking risks and do new things. Hiroshi started seeing that playing cards could only get the company so far, especially considering that they were primarily associated with gambling at the time, meaning the market for them was a bit limited, they didn't have wide appeal. But then Disney pulled a fast one and partnered with Nintendo in 1959 to create playing cards featuring the likes of Disney characters. This was a turning point for Nintendo. Finally, they could make Skyhawk! This venture helped broaden the appeal of their playing cards, bringing in families and children. Hiroshi changed the company's name one last time from Nintendo Playing Card Company to just Nintendo, and after experimenting with taxis, food, love hotels, vacuum cleaners, and a few more love hotels, and then some, they finally entered the video game market, with some classic duck-gutting. Fun for the whole family. The year is 1973, and Nintendo said, you know what would be funny? Going from sex hotels to arcade games justifiably, 1973 marked Nintendo's first foray into the video game market. Its name? Well, I know what Nintendo would name water now. From what I gathered, anybody with enough self-doubt would pay 100 yen to gut a pigeon, because screw waves, that's why. You'd shoot a light gun at a printed screen and shoot down any moving targets, displayed by an overhead projector. The idea was led by Hiroshi, of course, with assistance from Gunpei Yokoi, whose name you'll definitely hear at least twice in the next 10 minutes. He helped shape Nintendo into the company we know today, and that's largely attributed to these arcade machines, which he had a massive hand in. His and Hiroshi's plan was to install these things in former bowling alleys across Japan, which were getting shut down because Japan just hates bowling. Contrary to Nintendo kind of failing way past hard during this era, these things did relatively well, with many flocking to select test locations that had Ave Homicide 3000 in them. And that's all I got from the game's Wikipedia article. Look how small this thing is, you could tattoo this entire thing on your foot. And before anybody asks, no cyberbullying dogs in this one.
This is ridiculous!
Moving on, you ever wake up one day and just decide, yeah, screw oil. Well, Mr. 1973 oil crisis is all over that market, and due to the rising costs of oil during this time, production of these systems were put on standby, and Nintendo had plummeted into pretty bad shape, borderline bankrupt. It's not like today when Nintendo reports a loss in a quarter, like they have billions just sitting there, they're fine. No, this was 1970s Nintendo, they made Skyhawk, damn it. Despite all of this, the game still remains somewhat popular in Japan, leading to a smaller, cheaper version of the system.
Because everybody just needed to gut ducks with convenience.
That version would eventually become Wild Gunman in 1974.
Where are the ducks?
Not to be confused with the NES game that was heavily inspired by this one, Wild Gunman was another light shooter but with 100% more cowboy. There's nothing much on this one either. Is this a Wikipedia article or a thesis statement? There was, however, going to be an adult version of this game called Fascination for the Lonely Stench in All of Us. The gameplay was the same, but instead of cowboys there would be a Swedish woman and your goal was to shoot her clothes off. Yeah, this was scrapped. Over the years, a bunch more of these light shooters were developed and released for the Laser Clay system, and people actually began to care. These things were drawing international attention, with stuff like Shooting, Trainer, Skyhawk, or even Battle Shark gaining tons of popularity. Now, of course, if you couldn't already tell, the light shooter system was a very early prototype of what would eventually become Duck Hunt. You see, they developed the system first, and then the cyberbullying. But we're not here to talk about lights, there's a reason they stopped paying the electricity bill, so let's mosey on over to 1975, when Nintendo released the EVR race game. This game is credited by Nintendo as their first ever video game. Yes, the Laser Clay Machine had been released beforehand, but nobody wants to admit they made the Laser Clay Machine, so EVR race it is. This behemoth of a game could be played by up to 6 players, so if you actually had friends for some ungodly reason, bring them along to simulate what it's like to ride a horse. Well, it was actually more so a game of prediction. Each player would predict which horse would win, and then a race would be projected on the screen. From what I've gathered, this game was pretty complicated. Now, I would test it out myself to confirm this, but these machines are insanely rare, and I also have no friends. Now, following EVR race, the latter half of the 70s was home to quite a few new arcade games. A good few of these were original games like Test Driver, Driving Simulator where you had to do god anything but crash, or even Computer Odolo, a computerized version of the Odolo board game in case you wanted to feel embarrassed in public. You even had stuff like Sheriff, designed by none other than Shigeru Miyamoto, in which the player would have to commit homicide in order to gain credibility. Now, on the other hand, Nintendo never counted out plagiarism. Pixels aren't copyrighted, jackass, why not make Block Fever? And that's right, Nintendo also dabbled in the market of cheap knockoffs, releasing stuff like Space Fever and SF High Splitter, blatant clones of Space Invaders, as well as stuff like Head on End. Gee, I wonder what this one could be. Actually, this one is pretty complicated. It was a licensed Nintendo release of a Pac-Man clone, made by Sega. You can bet Namco was swimming in money that day. There was also Bomb BN, a blatant knockoff of Namco's Bombi, which itself was a knockoff of Breakout. Who was all this money going to? And to make it even more confusing, we have Space Launcher. This could easily be called a knockoff of Frogger, but it was actually released 2 years before Frogger, so Frogger's the actual knockoff here, but Space Launcher's art was a direct ripoff of Star Wars.
You know, I wouldn't mind paying the electricity bill again.
Now, all of the games I've talked about so far are computerized arcade games, which makes sense. These are made by the same company who brought us Clue Land. But there were a good few mechanical-based games too, like Deadline and Fancy Ball. These were pretty basic, just pachinko-styled games where marbles were to fall in certain slots and in turn give players the sweet, sweet prize of regret. But most interesting was definitely Smashmatic. If you've ever wanted to play badminton but without the fun, boy have I got news for you. The best way to describe it would be an arcade version of Pong. You use a button and a lever to paddle and try to get a ball past the opponent. All jokes aside, it doesn't sound half bad, but neither does playing actual Pong. Now, with the dawn of the 80s,
oh god,
Nintendo continued to release arcade games, starting the decade off with Hellfire, Space Firebird, and Radar Scope, all of which were pretty decent, albeit relatively generic. Hellfire is exactly what its name suggests. You get shot at by helicopters.
I thought it was a bear.
Space Firebird was a space shooter where the player took on swarms of Firebird enemies, and then Radar Scope. It's just goddamn Gallagher. These games did quite well too, at least in Japan. Everywhere else, yeah, that's going in the book of conspiracy theories. Regardless, their success in Japan helped form a new division of Nintendo, none other than Nintendo of America. These guys are great, they helped make Wario and exist. Anyways, then president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, saw the success of Radar Scope and Space Firebird and brought them over to America.
Because Gallagher just needed to be bluer.
Unfortunately, that never worked out. A delay in manufacturing and shipment pretty much shot down any possibility of these games coming over to America during the height of their popularity. So, while they did eventually come to the US, it was at a pretty bad time, and each of the games failed to receive much success.
But my blue Gallagher!
As a result of their failure, Nintendo had thousands of unplayed cabinets, presumably collecting dust in a warehouse somewhere. But they couldn't just leave it like that, of course not. This is the company that made Wario. Nintendo figured it'd be best to salvage these games by converting them. Initially, Shigeru Miyamoto was tasked with simply remaking breathtaking radar scope. Finally, I can play Blue Galaga, oh damn it! The first Nintendo game that anybody actually cared about was released on July 9th, 1981, going by the name of Donkey Kong, but you already knew that, you're human. Donkey Kong was a relatively simple game, but it set the standard for the platformer genre. In fact, it pretty much created the genre as we know it today. This thing is pretty neat. You play as, well, that was already patented, and climb up platforms to save Pauline, who can be seen up here in captivity by Donkey Kong. Well, there goes my wallet. Donkey Kong is considered to be one of the most important games released in the 80s, as well as one of the most important games released for Nintendo. Who knows where they would have been had it not been for Donkey Kong making Blue Galaga? If only. So like any other successful game, they made an excellent sequel. A faithful sequel. A sequel. Okay, that may be a bit too harsh. Donkey Kong Jr. is a fine game, but it doesn't hold the same magic as the original. To me, it just feels too clunky. I constantly find myself getting bored of the game after just a few minutes. Now, before you get mad, just remember I'm the guy who owns multiple copies of Brain Age 2. Do you really think my opinion matters? Nevertheless, the game did quite well. Come on, it was a sequel to one of the most successful arcade games of all time. It was bound to draw in at least a few morons. But here's the thing. Nintendo might have achieved success with Donkey Kong and its sequel, but that didn't automatically mean they were in the limelight. Need proof? Take a look at Sky Skipper.
I don't wanna.
Sky Skipper is a game, and not a good one at that. You control a helicopter and search for animals, along with the kingdom's king and queen. Just make sure you drop bombs on gorillas because the pigeons just weren't enough. There was a sequel to Space Firebird, Space Demon. Guess who?
Oh my god, it's Blue Galaga!
Now, we've all asked the question, where's the Popeye arcade game released by Nintendo? Maybe that's just me, but screw you I say, because it sure exists. This game had to play collecting items being dropped by Olive Oil, all while avoiding additional hazards. You see, that's great and all, but so's the year of the beast, 1983, the year when Nintendo gave up. 1983 saw the release of the Famicom in Japan, because why play Computer Odolo on a big box when you could play it on a slightly smaller big box? It was also at this time that Nintendo started diverting more of their resources to the Famicom, because Donkey Kong is just so much better when it's worse. Regardless, Nintendo was still in the arcade market, and knew they needed something to succeed Donkey Kong, because animal cruelty just wasn't gonna cut it. And Nintendo achieved that with their very next game, Mario Brothers. Right, first one to answer wins. What does this remind you of?
A bee!
This was the first game in the Mario franchise. Now, you may argue that the credit of the first Mario game would go to Donkey Kong, but this character goes by the name of Jumpman, so this is the first true Mario game, and it exists. This game featured two plumbers. Guess who? Your goal was to commit some more animal homicide, because Nintendo just loved gutting anything but humans. This was done by kicking them into pipes and off screen. It's a pretty fun time, all things considered. At least on the Famicom. When it comes to the arcade, nobody could have cared less. This was released in the US at the worst possible time. The whole gaming industry was doing the whole dying thing, so Nintendo as a whole was struggling, and Mario Brothers didn't really do much for the company. Now you'd think that this persisted, but don't worry, Donkey Kong 3 saved everything. 1983 marked the release of two more games, Donkey Kong 3 and the original Punch-Out, repetitiveness and all. The latter of those actually formed a few sequels, Super Punch-Out, not Super Punch-Out for the SNES, just Super Punch-Out for the arcades. It also formed the spin-off Arm Wrestling. I wonder what this could be about. It also, of course, was the basis for the NES game of the same name, and if you're willing to really stretch here, the series as a whole. And that is a wrap on Nintendo's history in the arcade industry, or at least games that were solely developed by them, that is. But that's not the end of their— hold on. Reign in the arcade market, because from that point on, every self-respecting human who hated credibility loved baseball, but really needed an extra two characters in their life. That brings us to the Versus series of games, arcade ports of their home console games, but with the multiplayer arcade experience in case you wanted to bring any of your friends from EVR Race along. These were manufactured for years, being released for the arcades between 1984 and 1990, and tons of games were featured, with some of them being considered Nintendo classics. Some of. But in 1992, outcry was heard across the world, as Nintendo announced they were no longer going to produce coin-op equipment.
Not Computer Odolo!
This basically marked the end of Nintendo's arcade games for a while, much to the dismay of everybody who played Space Firebird.
So nobody.
Suffice to say, Nintendo practically abandoned the market, choosing to focus more on their home console games since that's what was doing well at the time. They really should have had some foresight on that one. But that doesn't mean Nintendo stopped making them altogether. No, they don't just abandon the market, oh damn it. In Japan, a few stranger games were released, if you can really even call them that. There was stuff like Mario Roulette or Mario Sports Festival, the latter of which was a Dance Dance Revolution clone, and the former Yeah, I've got nothing for this one. Now, while it wasn't developed exclusively in-house, Nintendo helped Midway with several racing games, co-developing games like Cruisin' USA, Cruisin' World, and Cruisin' Exotica. I'm really starting to see a pattern here. There was also Cruisin' Blast in 2017, but Nintendo only licensed this game, and it was actually Raw Thrills that developed the thing, so I'm gonna give it the patented "who cares" and move on. Now, this wasn't the end of Nintendo's venture into the arcade market. In 2003, several third-party arcade games were released based on Nintendo IPs, and while they weren't developed by Nintendo, they did have a hand in them, so they count just as much as Computer Odolo. The first of these was F-Zero AX, because anybody who had F-Zero GX just needed some more shame in their life. Was owning a GameCube not enough? All jokes aside, this thing was pretty neat and a great compliment to its vowelless counterpart on the GameCube. Problem is, I can't confirm this thing is rarer than my integrity. There's only like 20 known cabinets of this game that exist. But then there's these Mario Party games, which were only available in Japan, and I checked, Nintendo's net worth is kicking itself. While we're on the topic of Mario Party arcade games, there's Mario Party Challenge World, which was released in 2016, and get this, was released outside of Japan. Great. There was also New Super Mario Bros. Wii World. If you've ever wanted to experience blandness with even more clunk, make sure you're enjoying it in Japan. It's considered a war crime to be played anywhere else. Now, if money exists, Pokemon unfortunately does too. This time in the form of mediocre arcade games. Most of these are in the form of coin pusher and pachinko games. And then you have Dancing Pikachu. Well, I'm sure somebody's living out their fetish. Most recently, Nintendo's released a few arcade games based on their home console stuff, the most notable being Mario Kart Arcade GP. This thing was a Mario Kart game that ran on a modified Double Dash engine, now with 100% more circle. This game did pretty well, even spawning a sequel. Now that name just spews creativity. Arcade GP 2 was more of the same, just with new characters, items, the whole 9 yards. There was also a third game carrying the subtitle DX, and when you look at that, I've actually played this one. It's because of that I can confidently say I don't like this. It's way too stiff and limited. I'd much rather just play a traditional Mario Kart. Now, if you enjoy Mario Kart but just hate cameras, may I suggest Mario Kart VR? There have been a few more of these third-party games, with the Luigi's Mansion rail shooter that's actually pretty awesome from what I've played, as well as Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games if you want to look like a complete idiot in public. Of course I do, look at me. And all of that useless blabbering brings us to today. I don't know about you guys, but I can definitely see modern Nintendo in a lot of these games, even the earliest of them. Not all of them are home runs by any means, but with a lot of them, you can see that Nintendo charm. Of course, with that charm, it was clear that they couldn't stick to the arcade business, and in the early 80s they moved over to home console video games, and from there on out, they have primarily been a home console gaming company. However, they still do throw in a fair amount of winks and nods to their past. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate features the sheriff from the game of the same name as an assist trophy, EVR Race is constantly noted by Nintendo on their websites, and stuff like Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong continue to be immensely popular names to this day. I love seeing them reference this kind of stuff, and I love looking back at this era of Nintendo. It's crazy to think that the same company that gave us Animal Crossing almost released a light gun pornography game.
Oh! I finally ripped out my medical diagnosis. I'm cured, and all it took was doing god anything but playing video games.
Nintendo in the arcades is just flat out interesting to me, and while I went on and on and on about how most of them were terrible, there's some certain magic to it that really shows that even from the very beginning, Nintendo's charm was always there. And if everything was perfect, well, I don't know what I would have done for the last 20 minutes. But spending your time wisely is important. Apparently it was all for the better of society. Karma does exist, and it cured me by talking about Nintendo in the arcades. So apparently it loves when you talk about Nintendo in the arcades. As long as you don't talk bad about Donkey Kong Jr.